They came from different places.
And this Ocean Academy isn't recognized as accredited.
It'll be a good thing, Dad.
They sailed for different reasons.
I don't want to be what I was when I left.
There you go.
Anonymous.
But there was only one way.
We'll do it together. I can't climb!
To survive on his ship.
I will challenge them, and they will come together.
Become a team.
Where we go one, we go all.
Because where he was taking them
What are they doing?
Claiming their place in the world.
could not be measured in miles. They thought they had survived the greatest challenge of their lives.
We had come through every kind of seas imaginable.
Except the white squall.
But it was only
White squalls are a phenomenon of the imagination.
the calm
What happened to my ship was not imagined.
before the storm. A film about loyalty,
Where we go one,
we go up, discovery,
But we're a crew. That's what this whole thing is about.
and courage.
Don't you walk out of this, Skipper, you don't!
Captain, they're only boys.
We listened to you, we believed you!
they're much more than that, sir.
And we are still here!
Jeff Bridges in a Ridley Scott film. White Squall, based on a true story.
Wow. Oh my goodness. I'll tell you, I really believe that movie just really depicts where we are today. Truly being challenged, but not only that, just to hold on tight, guys. I really believe that this may be the trump card that is being played because we are the crew within the White Squall. I really believe that. So today I want to welcome you all to Upfront in the Prophetic, where we go beyond surface level narratives and dig into the deeper currents of what's really going on in the world. Today we're with, I just love this man of God, SG Anon. It's been a while. We've been trying to get him on, and finally we have him on today. And if you don't know him, he's a respected voice in the geopolitical space, the media space, known for basically connecting all the dots together. And right now, we're seeing that the headlines are pointing towards escalation with Iran. But what if the real objective here isn't military conflict at all? Well, we're going to find that out. Well, with us today to unpack what's really going on is SG Anon. How are you, my brother?
Doing well, Francine. Thank you for having me back. It's good to be here.
Oh, it is so great to have you back with us. And, I really believe, we are at that point where it's, where we go one, we go all. And that's for sure. I mean, there's just so much going on. We're seeing almost like a split too, SG, some that were on board are now kind of segueing off. And I believe that there's a reason for all that. Wouldn't you say so?
Well, if you're talking about this sort of like perceived division that's coming out of different factional components of MAGA or this broader America First movement, I think that you're seeing a natural filtration event that happens with every people-led movement all throughout history. There's always a check and balance on the progress. Momentum builds and then it ebbs and then it flows again, and then it sometimes reverses in on itself and does a self-check, and then it builds again and moves forward again. And this is not anything to be worried about or afraid of. And I've been trying to tell people this really since these divisions began. But what it does do is it allows us to take a lens, right, a magnifying glass, if you will, and examine, well, what do people actually think, feel, and believe about America First? What do people think, feel, and believe about God's Great Awakening? What do people think, feel, and believe about this idea of a new earth that we're all building together and how that's going to work? And it allows for a great deal of clarity, a great deal of expansive understanding and expansive conversation to happen. And it also allows for the shaking out of the few truly bad apples that are, a part of the bunch. And you do have some, and some of them are, motivated by an agenda and they're nefarious in nature, and others are simply motivated by self-interest. And I think that makes them, a little bit more sincerely transgressive rather than just out and out, malfeasant against us. But what it allows is it brings this public opinion, this public discourse back to the gavel plate, if you will, where it was always supposed to be. And that's exactly the process that I think we're living through right now. I think you have a lot of individuals that have a hard time, quote unquote, trusting the plan. I think you have a lot of individuals out there that don't understand that there is a plan, and that's sort of a bridge gap that has to be made there, and that has to be talked about by people like those that are on this broadcast, and some of the folks that follow my work and others. We need to be outspoken about these types of things and let people know that there is a design, that there is a plan, and it is God's plan, but it's also a plan that was contrived to be executed through human hands. And so we're seeing that done now with the Trump administration, despite the chaos. We're seeing that done. We saw that done dramatically all throughout the Biden years here in the United States, and especially because of the chaos that caused a lot of people to pay attention. But when you really look at what happened, who did it help? It certainly didn't help the central bankers. It certainly didn't help NATO. It didn't help the Luciferian occultists who are being quite literally shelled by Russia mid-2022 in Ukraine. So looking at what's happening right now, there is a method to the madness, but when things turn up, when the temperature inside the pressure keg begins to really get sweaty, you have some that are not able to keep that calm demeanor on. They're not able to assuage that faith deeply enough, or maybe they need a reminder about that faith in order to move forward, to see it in a different light. And that's the period of time of growth, in my opinion, that we're living through literally right now.
Oh gosh, absolutely. Well, it's just like the beginning of that movie, that trailer. There was growth that the crew had to go through, and that's exactly right, SG. Do you think that Trump is actually now playing the Trump card?
No, I don't think this is the Trump card yet. I think what is going on right now is forced positioning. And to think about that in sort of like a term that a lot of people will relate to. We talk about forced positioning or repositioning things around the world. It can be likened to that psychological manipulation that occurs between like middle schoolers or high schoolers when one person wants one party to think something about another party and then wants that other party to think something about them. And so they sort of play off the orbit around those parties. You have different people that you can sow narratives with. You have different people that you can, sort of inoculate against a revelation that's going to come from one party or another, or perhaps you can plant a rumor amongst that crowd or a crowd 2 degrees out of that orbit and move it through that orbit into that crowd, right? These are tactics that we all sort of implicitly understand because we all lived there at one point in our lives. We all walked these types of situations and navigated this type of uncertainty, oftentimes in our youthfulness, but it's just as effective and it's just as real at the adult level in a far more complex and sort of multidimensional layered way. Someone said to me not very long ago, do you think that President Trump is waging war on Iran because of the actual reasons that he's saying? Do you think that he's actually waging war on Israel because of what's happening inside of Israel and there? Or do you think he's waging war on the Gulf states because of what's happening as a result of the Gulf state situation? And I said, Trump's not waging war on anyone. Trump is allowing the vestiges of the central banking mafia, the central banking empire, to wage war on itself. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen right now. Who's really suffering with what's occurring in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East and in that broader Asiatic landscape? It's certainly not the North Americas, although we pay a price at the pump, but that's about the biggest pain that we're experiencing right now. It's certainly not, the people of South America. They have different problems and projects of their own that they're still navigating, but you're seeing a lot of stress created inside of Western Europe and Central Europe. You're seeing a lot of stress created in Africa, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And these playgrounds, these stomping grounds, are essentially some of the oldest bastions of resource control and monetary flow control that exist connected to the royal families of Europe, the central banking mafia bloodlines, the Swiss corporations that manage a great deal of that trillions of dollars in wealth for some of these royal families. These are the individuals and parties that are having to really pay the price ultimately. And unfortunately, we the people are in the same house with them. And so there is a sort of shared pain, if you will, certainly much more focalized for these other institutions and interests, but there's still a shared pain that applies to everyone that's in the house together. And just for your audience out there, I want to clarify really quickly. When we talk about creating this pain, someone said to me in response to that about 2 weeks ago, well, you've got these oil stocks that are just flying through the roof. How is that pain for them? It's pain because the difference between what is real and what is perceived as real is growing by leaps and bounds. It's a bubble literally that's being created, a gap that's being created by what is being promised versus what can actually be cultivated, refined, and delivered. And when the bubble in that space, when that arena begins to truly burst and pop, it's going to have such a market cap to it, such a reverberative effect, that it will force other bubbles to pop across the economic landscape. And that will occur primarily in the Western world landscape and then sort of reverberate out to the global South. And this is going to force the redefinition of energy markets all around our planet, the same energy markets that have been centralized away from the control of we the people will be forced into a new dynamic. They'll be forced into a way of examining how they conduct trade, how they conduct flow, how they move things from point A to point B across boundary lines, across maritime shipping, how that's conducted, whether or not we see aircraft or aerial transportation innovated and then invented and brought out to the fore is something that remains to be seen. But the entirety of that landscape will shift when that bubble pops, and that will force a redefinition of finance, because you're going to have to find a way to keep the entire world's economy from plummeting into oblivion.
So the Strait of Hormuz in this significant equation really taps into the root of Britain, doesn't it? I mean, and the corruption that's been, coming out of that country. Wouldn't you say?
I absolutely would. If you research the pedigree of the late Ayatollah Khomeini from Tehran, you will find that he is either the son or the nephew, and I can't remember exactly which one, but I think he's the nephew of a British oil tycoon. This is not someone who is Persian born and bred. This is not someone whose blood lineage and heritage is predominantly Iranian. And so there is this overlap connectivity to the West that obviously exists because of that familial dynamic. But when you look at the companies and corporations that have been feeding into the Iranian oil landscape, it's a lot of international and foreign corporations, oil corporations, that are known to do business deals, extremely large business deals, with companies like Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips. And so all of these different groups have had access to the playground of the Middle East, the playground of the Persian resource landscape for a very, very long time. So the Hormuz Strait, I think, is right now being used more as a scapegoat than anything else to blame a great deal of these problems on, because the landscape has been sort of, pockmark detonated, if you will, in the lead up to these situations. It's been purposefully weakened at the knees through the activities of American oil and energy independence, through the activities of certain European countries transitioning away from oil and moving towards nuclear. I think France was one of the countries that did that. Spain might have been another country headed in that direction. Italy has certainly talked about it. The UK has talked about reopening the North Sea oil fields at one point. I don't think it's going to happen with Labour in power, but I certainly do believe that it's eventually going to happen, because the need has been created and the conversation now exists. You have Germany discussing how to cool relations, and Hungary as well, how to cool relations with Russia with respect to Russian energy, because Russia is an enormous repository for energy and resources that Europe has regionally right there in its arena. And President Putin, I think, is more interested in that than he is having a war on the European continent. He's made several remarks in the last 3 years that go loosely somewhere along the lines of, our fight is not with the Germans or the French or the Brightons or the Italians or whoever. It's not even with the Ukrainians. It's against the satanic Luciferian cult that influences the politics and the governments of the West, and certainly that has entrenched itself into Western corporate and Western finance, because one of Russia's high court rulings that banned, I believe it was Facebook from the country, identified Facebook as a tool of the intelligence community influenced by Luciferian ideology as well as other ideologies. So I think what we have right now, if I can extrapolate us back out to this 80,000 foot point of view, is again this forced redefinition of how these areas of the world have to think, operate, and behave with one another, and the simultaneous realization forced sort of into the face, and probably by the time it's all over, down the throat of those sleeping populations that still remain across the Western world, that their governments, that their institutions, that their agencies, all sides of them, are not working for them and are actively working to replace them.
Right. That's so good. But President Trump has often been associated with the unconventional strategies. I mean, how do you see like his actions right now aligning with the principles of the art of war?
Make your enemies destroy each other. That is the principle that he's leveraging right now, in my opinion. And I don't want to wax overly repetitive on the topic, but when you look at who's really paying the price with something just as focalized as the Strait of Hormuz, for example, it's not the U.S. We've seen a price spike at the pump, don't get me wrong, but the United States has dramatic oil reserves. And everyone sort of knows that at this point in time. Even the environmental groups that rail against them are aware that we are absolutely loaded with this particular resource. And so outside of some pain at the pump temporarily as we onshore American energy production and hopefully create a regulatory landscape that floods our landscape with what we need first and then exports the rest, what we can afford to export reasonably to the rest of the world, a country like China is not able to do that. China has to import more than 25% of all of its oil, crude, and natural gas petroleum derivative products from outside of the country. In other words, it has a demand that exceeds its need to satisfy the demand domestically. They do not have large reserves of oil that we know about. They have tremendous reserves of other extremely valuable and useful things, and Beijing is certainly aware of how to leverage those as bargaining chips. But when we look at what's happening here, you're seeing groups that have traditionally paid a pretty significant, played a pretty significant role in that exportation of intelligence community terrorism and deep state manipulation. You're seeing a lot of those countries really caught at the hilt with what's going on right now. Qatar is another example of that. I have no problem with the Qataris, but we have to acknowledge that Qatar has been a conduit for arms deals that have gone on in the Gulf states and in the Middle East, as has Bahrain, as has Saudi Arabia, as has Yemen, right? All of these different, Middle Eastern or Mesopotamian cultures that have existed there on the ground for a very long time with one another. Nobody is sort of like, clean hands at the pie plate. Everyone has had some fingers in there along the way. Some of them had just had the hand all of the way up to the wrist and beyond. Others, we had just a couple of fingertips. And so the point is, there's a lot of that goes on in this dynamic, and they're all being forced to pay the price with respect to just what's coming out of Hormuz. That doesn't even get into what I believe to be a coming blockade or restriction. Maybe not a blockade. Maybe that's too strong of a word. Let me be clear for the audience out there. I do believe that we're going to have some transportation inhibiting activities that are going to come to the, I forget the name of the waterway immediately south of the Red Sea. It's where the Gulf enters into the southern tip of the Red Sea. But I think it's going to happen in the Red Sea, and the Suez Canal is going to become a strategic choke point for a lot of what comes next with respect to this movement of the worldwide economy. As we blame Hormuz for these events that are happening, we should keep in mind that while Hormuz is a scapegoat, it's far from the only one. And having several different scapegoats together will encourage the planet to also adjust how they move things territorially, perhaps through the air, perhaps across land in different land routes based on regional need. So all of this, I think, to have a very long answer to your very short question, it's all about irregular war. It's about forcing cultures and military components, both for we the people and against we the people, into taking an honest position on where they're at, and then driving home a landscape that requires everyone to change or to adjust or to back up and punt or to reevaluate perhaps long-standing disagreements that have existed between nations based on needs, sort of like neighbors in a community all come together in the event of something cataclysmic like an avalanche or a volcanic eruption.
Yeah, wow, that's a great point. Yeah, and I know that there was so much backlash in regards to what Trump was doing, and yet now, I think even yesterday there were like over 100 tankers heading our way for oil, and I think a lot of people really didn't understand the significant part of what was really going on, thinking that it was, one way being weapons, but in fact, there was just so much more that pertained to this situation. It was so much deeper than what we've ever thought.
Well, and I think we're learning as an onlooking population coming out of our stupor and our slumber that what we see presented to us initially is very rarely the full truth. Things unfold in real time. Dimensions change and ebb and expand and contract based on how those things unfold. A lot of that becoming sort of happens in real time, especially when we're watching through the internet where we can see things hours or minutes or a day or two later. We're sort of watching the history being written. But the great lesson in that is that from the vantage point that we have as information consumers here in the Western world, if we're going to cross-reference that vantage point with the vantage point that military intelligence command has and what they're able to share with civilian intelligence agencies that then move that through to the president's daily brief, I think we need to acknowledge that perhaps we don't have the full picture, and maybe that's okay if we have a system that allows for a little bit of either trust or trustlessness, however you want to characterize that implicit state of status quo guarantee. And so I think what we have, for lack of a better term, is a gigantic learning experience on top of real actionable world changes that are occurring, which are interested, that, let me rephrase that are in the interest of we the people long term. We don't want, nobody wants, not even those of us who have benefited from it, want a centralized worldwide energy complex or construct that can at any point in the future be weaponized against us. We do not want that. We want redundancy built into the system. We want safeguards to be in place. That's literally why the United States has a tripartite check and balance system, because it was much more difficult to infiltrate and control a three-way triangle rather than a two-way back and forth, which is the partisan system that we've seen created inside of our bicameral Congress. And the same is true of the world at large. We want to know that if one area goes down because of a natural disaster or some craziness like a meteor strike or some enormous volcanic eruption or earthquake or whatever, that we don't then lose electrical connectivity or availability of aviation fuel across an entire continent. And so looking at what's happening right now in the world, these are the questions that are being fielded by all of the foreign ministers really in real time right now as they seek to iron out different ways of doing things. And you have delegations that have traversed between nations that don't normally do a lot of direct interaction with one another just since the Iran war began, talking with one another about the movement of grain, the movement of fuel, the movement of fertilizer derivatives, the movement of petroleum derivatives, the movement of urea and nitrate for fertilizers all around the planet, or nitrogen, excuse me, for fertilizers all around the planet. These conversations have been spawned off as a result of the things that are happening, and maybe, just maybe, we would be okay to trust the process a little bit. It doesn't mean to be ignorant of the process, but it does mean to not snap react at the first bad headline that we see.
Yeah, that's so good. We've heard Trump too, as of late, use the term reset, but I believe that there are so many out there that they're thinking that it's through a financial lens. But from your perspective, what is he actually signaling? Because he uses a lot of comms, and with those comms, he wants us to research the matter. So what do you believe that he's really talking about?
Well, I'm going to answer the question first by bringing up something that I think is extremely important to operate with as a foundational basis for looking at these types of things. Because I think if we don't have the context for it, then the meaning sort of gets murky and it loses its essence. We were told directly, unambiguously, in no uncertain terms, by an entity called Q Online that stated double meanings exist.
Yeah.
We were also told directly by that same entity, learn our comms. Expanded to extrapolate from that, the sentence would read, learn how we communicate. And so with double meanings being existent, that must mean that multidimensionality can or often does exist in the statements that come from government officials, from military pulpits, from intelligence communities, from investigative officials, etc. because there are hidden messages that are meant for other individuals, other parties, other entities. That has always been true. And let me say that it's always been true with the preface there that there has always been a system of evil in control in the background through its institutional control of some of the oldest schools of human life and human existence and the human journey. And that those levers and institutions of control have controlled what has occurred inside of our governments, and they love their symbolism. So, with that as the basis to the question, Trump comes out and says, world's most powerful reset. Well, reset's a big word.
Yeah, it is.
Reset's been utilized to describe Noah's flood.
Mm-hmm.
Reset has been utilized to describe what the Egyptian priesthoods called the great deluges of old, which preceded the year 10,000 BC, according to them. Reset has been used to describe what happened to old Tartaria and the massive floods, these people call them the great mud floods that came from various mountains and areas of raised terrain and would wipe out entire cities. There's a lot of that in Eastern Europe and in Western Russia. You can see evidence of it in North America. Cincinnati actually is one of those places that had a pretty significant event. And so reset has been used to describe those events as well. Reset has also been used to describe finance. It's been used to describe commerce. It's been used to describe valuation inside of various worldwide markets which affect finance, and it's been used to describe currencies. So when President Trump comes out and says world's most powerful reset, I think the meaning is a little of the essence of all of the above. You're seeing a spiritual reset. You're seeing a consciousness reset. You're seeing an international dynamic reset, inter meaning between two nations reset, how they operate and behave with one another. You're seeing financial reset for sure. You're seeing energy market reset absolutely happening because it's being forced. Quite literally, energy facilities are being targeted across the Middle East. Aramco, the largest and most valuable company on planet Earth, has now been hit by an Iranian missile, from what I understand, or an Iranian drone. They evacuated most of their facilities across Saudi Arabia, which is an enormous indication of who's really in control at the very top, because I don't think an evacuation order would ever have been given if we had the true Luciferians still in control of those decisions. I think they would have just sacrificed that fodder and laughed about it at the board table. And we have currency markets that are being forced into this position of needing a reset because of the different chaos and instability that's happening in the old system. How do you stop the coin operated bucking horse when it's had a short circuit and it won't stop anymore? You have to give it a different kind of power. You have to pull the power and move into something else. And you certainly have to stop the activities of that right then and there with some sort of balancing mechanism. And so the balancing mechanism, in my opinion, is this emerging system of currency control, which will have standardized values behind the currencies themselves. And the currencies will drive the monetary policy, which will drive the fiscal policy, which will drive international commerce. It's sort of like a downstream thing, but you have to go to the singularity. You have to get to the source. And I think President Trump is trying to drive that reset in particular. And if I was to guess what he's talking about, I would think currency is probably what he's referring to. But you cannot reset currency without resetting everything else.
Right.
And that's why it becomes a world's most powerful reset, because from what we know, it does appear to be the first time in all of world history that these resets on the dimensions of human society have been done simultaneously. And to achieve that and not end up like the ancient city of Atlantis, I think is a monumental and generational accomplishment that will go down in legend for a very long time here in the world, and not just in the Americas. I think you're going to have these stories of these times told regionally and culturally all around the planet in the lens of their faith and in the lens of their God for a very, very long time. And I think it's going to be mostly positive, because at the end of the day, once the thumb is removed from the scale of all of these different markets, all of these different regionalities, all of these different international dynamics, all of these different economic cooperatives and behaviors, all of these different shipping lanes, all of these different financial organizations and banks and commerce sectors, currency itself, military application, transnational criminal behaviors applying pressure to governments. Once all of that is removed, who really knows what we can unlock here in the world? I think it'll be dramatic.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Thus now the 250th anniversary. And I think a lot of this, I think we're right in the window of all of these things happening. You know, some people, okay, grab your popcorn because it's going to get wild in the next couple months here. And yeah, so what you unpacked here was really a restructuring of global power and control systems across the board. That's huge, you know, and so many of us, you know, SG, we were like, okay, this is the, you know, years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, you know, oh, we're right there. We're right there. But oh my gosh, we were definitely not right there. But now we are, to see everything being unpacked before our eyes. I mean, this is so biblical.
It absolutely is. And I want to remark on that, if I can, for just a moment. I think all of us have had to step back and appreciate the pace, you know, but I do think that a lot of the reason that you had many individuals as early as 2019, 2020, and 2021 talking about being right there, we're on the cusp, we're on the precipice, I think that's a function of having the eyes to see and understanding where the book ends, understanding where the play goes, and being extremely excited to know that for the first time, we write a story as one human civilization that does not end badly for us, that does not end in, you know, some sort of serpentine interest or some sort of secret societal devil taking control of components of this planet and wrenching that away from the bloodlines that were given control of the world to begin with. And so looking at that and beholding it in real time, you know, I think about what it would be like to have been like the prophet Jeremiah, knowing what was going to happen, knowing what was coming, seeing things begin to move in that direction in real time, and what that must have been like for him. Now, of course, in that story, you know, the ending is not so good. This was a man who was given a vision of pretty significant destruction that would befall God's temple and the entirety of the city and the nation. And so as you're watching those pieces fall into play, I'm sure was very, very, you know, demanding and upsetting. But the opposite, in my opinion, is happening now for a great many individuals out there who can see that this goes to a place, not utopia per se, but certainly a more balanced, more fun, way more enjoyable standard of life and standard of living and basic expectations about life than what we have known in generations past and in generations before. And we're all sort of conscious of that process happening. So it becomes difficult, I think, to extract ourselves and appreciate that for a group of consciousness over a long period of time, or excuse me, for a group of consciousness, it takes oftentimes a longer period of time for things to shift and set in, because you do need to find agreement on some collective issues, but you need enough variety to maintain the excitement, to maintain the contrast, if you will, the things that continue to drive us forward and give us that vigor and that determination and that true diversity, not DEI, but actual true diversity, which leads to all sorts of, you know, wonderful new inventions and advances and advancements and things like that. So I don't want to wax too long on the issue, but it's an amazing time to be alive because acknowledging what we had before and then moving into what we will have, maintaining that vision despite timelines and despite time frames, that is how we win. That is the definition of faith.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And you just brought a verse to me in regards to taste and see that I am good. And, you know, I see that God has ordained Trump for such a time as this, President Trump, for such a time as this. And when you look at what the Lord has always intended for us, you know, healing, and then we have the med beds, right? The financial, and then we have everything that was stolen from us, you know, be it birth certificate, you know, so many other things coming back to us. I mean, this truly is a taste and see that I am good moment of what God has been planning. We trust a plan, and we trust God's plan, and what He has for us. And so that's what you just said, just brought that to my memory, because we are heading for a different times to where people are not struggling, because all people will benefit, not just those that have currency or other investments, but all people. So we are in a great time.
I would agree with that tremendously. And it's difficult, I think, for patriots to maintain the rosy colored glasses. And I think sometimes you run the risk of being called intellectually irresponsible, right? Well, you're not acknowledging what I'm seeing right in front of my face and the meaning that I derive from that. Ergo, you must have some sort of deficiency. And I don't think that that's a good way to look at it either. I think what you have truly is dimensionality that hits different people at different levels. You have a lot of the alternative media landscape now that has begun to break itself into what I would have characterized as, a non-adjacent playing grounds for a long time. Things like what happened with Pizzagate,
Sure.
the stuff that went on, the true stuff that went on with Epstein. When we talk about true stuff, we're talking about, the different layers of depth to that, and the depravity that was involved in that, much more than just the simple act of trafficking, which itself is certainly depraved, but you have different levels of what is, of that sadism that I think you can rank with that. And so seeing
Sure.
a lot of those subject matter being tossed about now by what I would characterize as sort of like post-mainstream names. Tucker Carlson is one. You have several others out there that have taken, Cam Higbee is another one who's talked about this. Theo Vaughn has talked about it pretty significantly. These are individuals with very, very massive reach. They're relatively moderate politically. They don't appear on their face to be ideologically motivated. It's difficult to tell, of course, these days, but on their face, it doesn't appear to be a thing. But yet they are broaching these very serious topics about geoengineering and chemical warfare and the stuff that goes on with Epstein, the stuff that goes on inside of our governments, these very, very wasteful sort of recreational parties that government officials are going to, oftentimes not in Washington, D.C. The Bilderberg Group, being in Washington in 2026. I just saw that very recently covered on, I forget, I can't remember the name of the podcast right now. It might have been Joe Rogan, but it was covered, very recently, just within the last few weeks, about where that was going to be held and what to expect for that. Say last few weeks, it might have been 8 or 9 weeks ago now. It's been a minute, but regardless, the whole point is, as we see these subjects continue to be expanded upon, and these larger, broader audiences continue to come to understand, well, the nature of the corruption is actually this, or the nature of the corruption is actually that. It's not very long before they arrive at bloodline families, the Illuminati, the royals of Europe, potential non-terrestrial demonic influence, a great deal of the occultism, behind secret space programs like NASA, for example, and others. All of that leads us to this collective understanding that the world itself is not as we were told. It's actually much nicer. It's much greater. It can be much better. And that's what we're waiting for. We're waiting for the realization from those that I would characterize as just now beginning to open their eyes and understanding the greater picture. We're waiting for that realization where they say, wow, if it was this bad, how good could it actually be?
Right. Oh, that's so good. You just mentioned NASA, and I just had to laugh a little bit here. Artemis, they did a little interview, and he was holding the ball, and they were supposed to be in flight or whatever, and the ball falls down, and they tried to, like, oh my gosh, it fell down. They're going to know, I'm like, oh, that was so hilarious. I wish I had that clip right now so people could see that, and they're just like, kind of like, no, just forget it. Just, leave it there.
Smile and wave, boys.
Right.
That's absolutely the attitude. And it's glorious to watch when you do have, again, the perspective to notice these types of things. Something that I thought, and the Artemis mission is being used, I think, as an evaluation metric for where people are at with respect to the overall awakening. When
Sure.
we saw the clip where they had put out that they were having malfunctions in the lavatory on the ship itself, and they were on their way, and they're sort of in transit. And I think one of the guidances that was given was something unbelievably ridiculous, like don't pass gas through the body or something like that because the oxygen concentration or whatever. I started thinking to myself, this is very much in your face, sort of joking and like jester level clowning around, because if you cannot offload waste in the sense that you are stuck somewhere and you're not able to get to a bathroom, what are you full of? You're full of crap. And
Right.
so looking at what's happening, it's just, in my opinion, I think this entire Artemis excursion and escapade, while extremely encouraging and extremely enheartening and empowering for the United States, its people, its citizenry. I don't want to knock the benefit of that whatsoever. All of that is true. All of that is authentic in the sense that it generates a real reaction, but it's not, in my opinion, actually happening. I think that what we're being told here, or what's happening here, is a broad show and tell. You can't show the people, you really do have to tell them, and a gauging of where people are at and how willing they are to have the public discourse about what is this thing, what is that thing, what does it actually mean, when it carries so much implied meaning for the nation itself. And that's something I think we as Americans have to relearn how to do again, because we've gotten away from being willing to have the conversations that are perhaps, at perpendicular purposes with one another.
Yeah.
We have to have those conversations, even when it's something that we care deeply about, even if it's about our history or about our participation in active conflict or about our participation and status as a place in the world. Like with these space undertakings, we have to acknowledge what is real, what's not, and engage on these topic matters and filter that truth out for ourselves, so that we arrive at a conclusion that does in fact represent the self-representative majority. We do have a democratic style republic. We have a representative majority that is supposed to have its will reflected, with the rights of the individual always maintained and kept intact. So how do we do that again? And I think that's something that we're learning here with things like Artemis. But yes, the CGI with the videos was, I thought, relatively second class. I didn't think that it was overly impressive. We've got, this grainy footage of all of these different things that Artemis did that looks like they filmed it underneath water in a swimming pool, and I can't imagine why it looks that way. It looks like it's all from 1973 and just recycled with different layovers in the film. And so all of that, plus the ball incident that you described, the clear messaging from the failures that they're having on board and these types of things. The video that we have from, this isn't from Artemis, but this is from the Blue Origins or Blue Horizon, whichever one is Jeff Bezos's space excursion thing. The video we have of them accidentally popping the hatch door from the inside prior to Bezos arriving with his lever to actually take the door off. So they had to do a reshoot. It was literally a take two. All of these things let us know that we're being played with in some way, but it also allows us to come together as a collective and unify on the same basic understandings. And we need to have those understandings before we can have any sort of cohesive civilizational dynamic with one another or with what we'll call angels and demonic entities moving forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Just want to give a shout out to Susan. Glad you're here as well. And people are responding and enjoying what they're hearing today. SG, totally amazing. Then we have President Trump trolling the Pope. And I believe that too is just to draw people to do their research on who, this guy really is and what they've been doing for centuries. Wouldn't you agree?
I would. I sort of look at Pope Leo as a figurehead that, may end up completely transforming the Catholic Church, and maybe not even because of his active influence so much as his passivity on certain things, and his willingness to comport with other things that I think fly in the face of the faith itself. I'm not an expert on Catholic faith, and so I want to preface my opinion on this whole issue by acknowledging my ignorance of it, because I'm not an expert in the rituals and the rites and the different sacraments that they use and how those festivals and feast days are observed. But I do notice when a church leader is, seemingly much more involved in arenas that don't primarily concern themselves with the church, then perhaps makes sense. And I've seen a lot of that with Pope Leo, various political statements that almost seemed out of place.
Right.
Not necessarily like bad statements, but just statements that didn't seem appropriately timed. It didn't seem like they made a great deal of sense with respect to stuff in Africa, stuff in the Middle East. It's very interesting to see some of the stuff that he said about Israel, because I personally am not a huge fan of the Israeli government, but I don't believe some of the things that the Pope actually shared were fundamentally true. I don't think they were well researched. And so, looking at this and seeing the evolution of, Christianity overall in the Western world and the resurgence that it's making, and the, genuine seeking to connect to, the Spirit of Christ and what Christ taught us that we were supposed to connect to through Him, I think a great deal of that helps to inform, individuals, helps to inform our response to individuals like the government of the Vatican, or like the governance of the Catholic Church, the Vatican Church. And it would not surprise me again if we start to see this, begin to dismantle the upper echelons without imploding the entire church body, because you don't want to alienate 2.5 billion people of faith.
Sure.
If you are an overarching interest attempting to return the planet to a proper state of balance, because that doesn't help anything either. What you do want to do is provide enough of an on-ramp for people to stay true to the tenets of their faith, stay true to what they know to be true with respect to God, with respect to how they see the world, with respect to their history itself, but also enough of an off-ramp at the very top where they can dissociate a little bit and accept that their institution, their school of thought, their belief and faith house was sort of taken over at the very, very top, and it was done so quietly and so clandestinely that not a lot of individuals, after a certain executive management level at the very top, not a lot of individuals were aware of what was actually occurring and how that that co-opting had happened over the last 1,500 years or so. I think it goes back as early as like 382, 384. So, looking at all of that and seeing how that has evolved, Pope Leo he almost seems like the perfect figurehead for that, because he's just milquetoast enough to not really push in any direction, which I think tends to alienate all sides. Even Christ said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And this is someone that doesn't seem to want to do that. But the times that he does do that, it almost seems unrelated to what the general business of the papacy would be about.
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. And hey, I was raised Catholic until my mom got spirit filled, and filled with the Holy Ghost and fire. And then we realized, what we had stepped into. But there are a lot of wonderful Catholics out there, and a lot of them are segueing into like the charismatic move, to where they're really celebrating, the gifts of the Holy Spirit and opening to that. So there is a reawakening to the truth, and really finding out what that faith or that religion, I would say, really was or is about. So there's a lot going on within different faiths. I mean, we have the oh, okay. Yep. Gotcha. And so a lot going on. So, lastly, let me just ask this, because I know time is precious here for you. I'm very busy. So what should people be paying attention to right now that maybe isn't highlighted in the mainstream media?
I think the biggest thing for people to pay attention to at the present moment is the buildup of Russian troops again in southwestern Russia. I think you're going to see the entirety of Zaporizhzhia province in Ukraine taken by Russia here relatively soon. I think you're going to see the entirety of Odessa province, which includes the port city of Odessa, which is Ukraine's largest port city and one of their primary import and export areas. I think that's going to come under Russian control. And that's really going to spin things up in Eastern Europe quite a bit. And no one's talking about that, because everyone's talking about the Iran situation or the broader spiritual evolution that we were just talking about a moment ago. I think everyone can sort of see that happening too in real time, and that's a good thing. But with respect to the more surface level, coming back down, if you will, to like the land of the trees, I think the next major move will come from Russia. I think Moscow is currently lining its pockets with as much high dollar oil, natural gas, and petroleum products that they can sell in the international space to fund that wartime economy and this current buildup that's going on. But, Russia is extremely patient, but I do not believe that the Russians are going to remain patient as we go forward here. And President Trump is publicly distancing himself from Ukraine. And that's the tell in it for me. The fact that we're now seeing President Trump basically deride Zelensky in the public space, refusing to send certain U.S. provisional packages because of the Iran situation. We have to feed our own nest before we feed your nest, that sort of stuff.
Sure.
Calling him a small man, I think was something he said that he referenced about 4 or 5 weeks ago. He's not someone who wants peace.
Right.
So I think President Trump is purposefully creating narrative distance where ultimately if Russia moves in a grander way on Ukraine, Europe will be forced to decide, is it worth it or is it not worth it? If the U.S. is just going to sit on the sidelines, then maybe it's not worth it. And I think that's where you'll see any sort of major NATO counter punches, if you will, begin to come to the fore. And I would estimate that we see some of that. I don't want to give like hard and fast time frames, but I would be surprised if we did not see movement on some of those campaigns as the winter begins to really thaw up there in Eastern Europe sometime over the next 30 to 90 days. Again, it's not a hard and fast prediction, but it would make a great deal of sense, especially going into this 250th birthday for America. And that's going to redefine, in my opinion, Francine, it's going to redefine a lot of what NATO is and is not for. It may even result in the dissolution of NATO, and it's going to redefine the dynamic in that segment of Eastern Europe that borders Russia, where Russia will likely establish a buffer zone. And if we get to a peace with the Ukrainian situation as a result of this hypothetical advancement that I'm talking about, then I think that in those negotiations, you would see that buffer zone created perhaps all the way up to Kiev. So it's going to be a really incredible time as we go through the remainder of this year and into early next year. We've got 3.5 years almost, or 3 years, I guess, at this point left of this particular Trump presidency. I think we should all sit back and enjoy the ride. God really does have this, but taking out the old system of enslavement and death was never going to be easy.
No, not at all. Not at all, SG. My gosh. Hey, I wanted to put this out on the screen too. If you all are ready to change your life and change your story, contact us at that 800 number. We are also partnering with a company called Manna Relief, where we have fed children for over 25 years in 90 countries. There's a lot of you on that are listening that say, hey, I would have loved to go to the mission field or help orphanages. Well, this way, you surely can. So SG, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's just been amazing. Just your incredible insight. And what we're seeing may look like chaos on the surface, but underneath what appears to be pretty much calculated shift in how power, influence, and control are structured. And for our audience, I just want to say, please stay grounded, stay discerning, stay in prayer, and watch the patterns and listen to the comms, because if you do, you'll find out exactly where we are. And I've always trust in God, because he's at the helm and he's going to watch over us. That's for sure, because he makes the crooked places straight, the rough places smooth. And that's exactly what he's doing, SG. So SG, where can people find you?
I can be found on my same 4 places still online. I'm on rumble.com at the handle rumble.com/user/QNewsPatriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SG Anon, but I can be found on Truth Social by the name SG Anon at the handle real, REAL, SG Anon with a red check mark. I can be found on X at the handle THEQ News Patriot with a blue check mark. And I can be found on Telegram as well at the address t.me/real, REAL, Q News Patriot. It is an incredible time to be alive, Francine. And again, all we have to do is trust in God, because at the end of the day, this entire battle is won. It's just a very long finish for those of us that have seen the outcome from the beginning of the book.
Oh, that's so true, SG. And please know that we are on Rumble and YouTube now. Woohoo! They've allowed us to come back on starting at ground zero. So go ahead and subscribe on YouTube. So appreciate that. And I just want to bless you, SG, and your family and all those that are listening. Just know that God has gone before us. He is making the crooked places straight. Just rest in him. Lean not on your own understanding, because just like what SG said, we are victorious in Christ Jesus. God bless you, everyone. And thanks for joining us on Upfront in the Prophetic. Blessings, SG.